I recently did a video about the top lures to fish in the month of June, but if you do not know where to throw those lures, you're still gonna go out there and you may not catch a lot of fish. So that's what today's video is all about, showing you exactly where the bass are in the month of June. So stay tuned, it's gonna be a good one. This video is brought to you by sportsmansoutfitters.com. I shop at Sportsman's Outfitters. They have some of the best prices on your favorite lures. And not only that, right now they're having a Father's Day sale. So you can save a lot of money right now by clicking on the links down below in the description and doing some shopping while everything is on sale. So if you want to help support the Bass Fishing HQ channel, click those links down below. The month of June is truly one of my favorite months to go out fishing. You can have some phenomenal fishing out there. And the reason being is that to me, the month of June is really kind of a pick your poison type of month. And what I mean by that is when you pull up to any given body of water, you're going to have bass that are deep, you're going to have bass that are really shallow, and you're going to have bass that are in between. So when I say pick your poison, what I mean by that is whatever you feel most comfortable with. Maybe you're a shallow water fisherman, then stay shallow and figure out the shallow fish. Now, if you are a deep water fisherman and you like to use your electronics, then focus on that deep water because bass are going to be continually coming to you. Now, in this video, I'm going to give you 3 patterns that I look for on any body of water that I go to during the month of June. It's going to include some shallow water fishing and some deep water fishing. So let's jump into those patterns right now. Now, the first pattern that I want to talk about is a more shallow water pattern. So if you like to fish shallow, this is for you. And the thing about it is that this pattern, you can catch some of the biggest bass on your lake fishing this way. And it's something that I always look for, not only in June, but also in July and August. And that is fishing around bluegill beds or brim beds or perch beds, depending on what you call them. Pretty much during the entire summer, I mean, June, July, August, you're gonna have periods of time that bluegill come up to shallow water and they're going to make beds. And I have found it that some of the biggest bass in the lake will be feeding on those bluegills that are actually bedding. Now, one of the biggest keys to this pattern is finding active bluegill beds, because you will be going down the bank and you may see a bluegill bed, but if there's not a bunch of bluegill in it, if it is not an active bed, then you might as well just keep on fishing and not pay attention to it. Those bluegill actually start spawning typically around full moons and new moons that happen during each month. So if you're fishing during those times, full moon or new moon, this is something that I really pay close attention to. Now, one of the best things about fishing bluegill beds is that you do not need any type of electronics typically to find these bedding areas. A lot of times you can just visibly see them with your own eyes. And bluegill will spawn in lakes, rivers, and ponds. So no matter what type of body of water that you are fishing, you can use this pattern to catch June bass. Now, with that being said, I have seen bluegill beds all over the lake at times. I've seen them in the back of pockets, and I have seen them even on the main lake. But probably the #1 place that I always look for bluegill beds is actually secondary points in a creek. A lot of times it seems like on the sides of secondary points is where you will find those bluegill beds. Now, typically the bass are going to hang just around the edge of those beds, and they're going to prey upon the bluegill that are actually trying to make their own little babies. Now, probably the #1 thing that I look for when it comes to fishing around a bluegill bed is some sort of piece of cover that is really close to that bed itself. If you have some aquatic vegetation that kind of surrounds that bluegill bed, or if you have a big laydown that's somewhere close to that bed, or that bluegill bed is really close to some docks, a lot of times bass are going to hang around that cover and they will shoot up, grab a bluegill, and then kind of come back to that piece of cover. So a lot of times when I fish the actual bluegill bed, I'm not casting in the center of that bed. I'm really focusing on the cover that is on the outskirts of that bed, and that is how you can catch those fish. Now, my #1 tool for catching these fish is typically some sort of topwater bait. I really love a prop bait in this situation, and we kind of talked about that in the June video, which I will link down below. But another thing that you can do is simply cast a wacky rig to the outside of that bluegill bed. This is truly a big fish pattern, and if you find bass that are feeding on bluegills, a lot of times if this is a tournament situation, I will just go around and simply mark as many active bluegill beds as I can, and then you can come back and fish them extremely quickly in a tournament. You can hit 30, 40, 50 bluegill beds in a day, and you can have the biggest bag of your life fishing this way. Now, we just talked about a shallow water pattern. Now I want to go on the complete opposite side of the spectrum and go to that deep water. And to me, offshore fishing is at its best during the month of June. And the reason being is that you have a lot of fish that have been shallow, they have been spawning, and a lot of times they are starting to make their way out to some of their first kind of summertime areas. In those areas, man, I'm telling you what, you can find not only huge schools, but it seems like bass are just really actively biting during this time of the year. When they first get to that offshore spot, this is a lot of times when you can catch them on deep diving crankbaits. Now for me, I typically use a swim bait a lot of times to find these fish, because I just feel like the swim bait gets a lot more bites these days with so much fishing pressure. Now when it comes to finding that honey hole, you know, that place that we see guys on TV where they are just back to back to back, just absolutely whacking the fish, I kind of have a process of how I go about it to actually find these little areas. Now the first part of the process will help eliminate a lot of water, and for me, the biggest thing that I look for is I look for the main pieces of structure that are outside some of the biggest spawning areas on that lake. So if you have a really big creek arm and you know a lot of bass are spawning in that general area, that first piece of structure, a lot of times this can be the points that lead into that creek, or maybe there's a ledge outside of this creek or a hump outside of this creek. Those are the areas that I typically start in the month of June. So now that I have a general area of where I think the bass could potentially be, the next thing that I like to look for is there's areas where I think current is hitting the greatest. Now this could be current that is generated from a dam, or this could be current that is generated from the wind. A lot of times as you have that current that is coming down the lake and it is hitting on certain areas of that structure, those areas are typically where you're going to find really clean rock, and you're going to find shell beds. And those are two pieces of cover on structure that I love to find during this month. So now we have a general area where the structure is, and we have an idea of where that current is kind of hitting on the structure. The next thing that you must have is bait, some sort of bait fish in the area. So really, if you look outside those major spawning areas and you find an area where that current is hitting and there's bait fish there, I can almost guarantee you that there's going to be bass in those areas as well. Now, like I said, I typically start out with a swim bait, kind of creeping it along the bottom, but a lot of times when I start catching fish, I'm gonna pick up a big worm. It's one of my favorite baits to fish. I'm gonna cast that big worm out there, drag it slow across that shell, across that rock. Maybe there's some stumps or brush piles out there, and while you're out there dragging that big worm, you can catch some of the biggest bass of your life. Now, although those two patterns can be dynamite in the month of June, they're actually not my favorite way to catch bass during this month. And my absolute favorite way to catch bass during the month of June is actually fishing aquatic vegetation, actually fishing grass or weeds. To me, if you have a lake that has grass in it, whether that's hydrilla, milfoil, coontail, whatever it may be, if there's a lot of grass in your lake, the biggest populations of big bass are going to be relating to that grass. The great thing about fishing grass is you can find small areas that have an absolute ton of bass in them. I'm talking about winning caliber type fish, a lot of big fish. The bad thing about grass is that it can take a long time to find these little spots. This is truly a needle in the haystack type of approach, but if you put in the work and find these little areas, a lot of times, one, you're gonna have them to yourself, and two, like I said, you can catch a ton of fish in these areas. Now, to me, the best grass is going to be main lake oriented. So kind of like what we talked about with deep water, I'm gonna look for big flats that are outside major spawning areas. Those big flats, if they have grass on them, that's an easy place for fish to move off from their spawning area into that grass and really start feeding up and getting really, really thick. Now, something that is pretty interesting to me, but almost always seems to hold true, no matter if you're fishing in New York or Tennessee or Florida or Texas, is that the best grass typically grows in about 6 to 10 foot of water. Now, this is not always going to be true, but it seems like a lot of areas where I have found some of the best fishing in grass, I'm always in that 6 to 10 foot. So something that I like to do when I get to a body of water and I know there's grass there, I'm actually gonna use my electronics and shade from 6 to 10 foot. And then I'm going to idle around those areas and try to find where the grass is. Now, kind of like if you are fishing offshore, if you have a good grass line outside those major spawning pockets and you have bait present, whether that's bluegill or shad, whatever it may be, that is going to be a place that holds a lot of bass. Now, the only bad thing about fishing grass is it can be really, really overwhelming. I mean, you may find a giant flat that is acres and acres and it is just full of grass. So I actually made a video that really goes through how to decipher what is good grass and what is bad grass, and I'm gonna link that right here. In this video, I really try to pick apart how to find the best grass fishing areas where you can catch a lot of bass. So click that video next. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, comment below, and I'll see you guys in the next video.